The wind howled across the plains, relentless and cold, biting at the very marrow of bones. Elias stood in the frozen silence, his hands wrapped around the handle of a shovel, the ground beneath him a solid sheet of ice. It had been 3 nights since the storm, the blizzard that had swallowed the horizon whole, and with it, Max, his dog, his last remaining companion, gone. He had shouted for the German shepherd, his voice swallowed by the howling winds, but there had been no answer, not even a faint whine, not the reassuring bark that had kept the loneliness at bay for 5 long years. Elias had searched for 3 days and 3 nights, each step in the snow deeper than the last, until hope had become an anchor too heavy to carry. The blizzard's aftermath left the ranch barren and cold, much like his soul. The house, weathered by time, looked no different. It was a stark silhouette against the endless sky, its windows empty, like hollow eyes, watching a world too vast for a man to feel anything but small. Elias had known loss, the kind of loss that doesn't whisper in the dark or rattle chains in the silence of the night. It pressed down on him constantly, a weight in his chest that no air could relieve. His wife, his daughter, gone in a single, cruel instant. That pain never left. Just like the wind, it carried with it everything that had been torn from him. And Max? Max was his only link to a life he had left behind. His dog had been a reminder that he hadn't disappeared entirely. But now, that final tether was gone, swallowed whole by a storm. He struck the shovel into the hard ground, each blow resounding in the vast emptiness around him. He was alone, and the silence pressed in, thick as the snow that buried the ranch. The rhythmic thud of his hammering was the only sound left in the world, until something made him pause. A figure emerged on the horizon. Elias squinted, eyes narrowing against the blinding white. At first, he thought it was the storm, swirling back, returning to claim him. But no, a shape, a silhouette. His heart gave a strange, painful lurch. It was Max. The dog's gait was slow, deliberate. He was limping, his body battered by the harshness of the storm. But there he was, the dog's broad head lifted high, eyes locked on Elias as if the world had never been lost. And trailing behind Max, a woman. She was a ghost, a fragile figure in the snow, staggering beneath the weight of exhaustion. Elias's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, her appearance so delicate and out of place in this desolate world that for a moment it felt like a dream. She was Chinese, her dark hair tangled by the wind, her silk dress torn by the journey. She moved slowly, as though every step was a battle she was losing. Max trotted ahead, whining softly as he reached Elias. The dog's amber eyes looked up at him, then back at the woman, pleading. The message was clear. She was his charge. Elias, rooted to the spot, could only stare at the stranger, her fear evident in the wide, unblinking eyes that watched him with a mix of distrust and desperation. Elias could feel his chest tightening. For 5 years he had lived in the protective shell of isolation. He had crafted this life, solitary, empty, carefully, intentionally. And now, this woman, a stranger, a ghost of another world, stood in the doorway of it, brought there by his dog. Max's soft whine pulled him from his thoughts. The dog nudged Elias's hand with his cold nose, then returned to Leanne's side, sitting at her feet, offering her a silent but firm assurance. She is to be trusted, it seemed to say. She is with me. Elias's instincts warred with each other. The years of solitude screamed for him to send her away, to keep her from crossing the threshold. But the silent plea in Max's eyes, the animal's pure loyalty, broke through the wall of his reclusiveness. If Max had led her here, through the bitter winds, through the barren wasteland, there had to be a reason. With a subtle nod, he gestured toward the house, his hand still resting on the dog's head. Without a word, Elias turned on his heel, his long strides eating up the earth beneath him. He didn't look back, not to see if she was following, because he knew. She had no other choice. The steps to the house were slow, measured, and in the stillness of the wind, they seemed to stretch on for miles. Every step, each footfall in the hard, frozen earth, was a reminder to Elias that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. This woman, this fragile, lost creature, was now a part of it. Behind him, Max trotted faithfully, pausing only to glance back at Leanne, encouraging her to follow. She hesitated only for a moment before she began to move, the warmth of the dog's silent presence urging her on. The house stood at the end of the walk, small and unassuming. To anyone else, it would seem like a place to escape from. To Elias, it had been nothing but a shelter, a haven built from wood and stone, but empty, hollow. It had known no warmth, no joy, no laughter in years. But as the door creaked open, and Elias stepped aside to let Leanne pass, something in the air shifted. The warmth inside, the crackling fire, the scent of wood, smoke, and leather, met her with a rush of comfort so sudden it almost knocked her over. It was a welcome relief from the biting cold that had marked her journey. She stepped inside, clutching a small, faded bundle to her chest. The room, though plain, seemed to hold an echo of something lost. There were no photos, no trinkets to speak of, only the barest necessities. But in this desolation, she found a strange kind of peace. Elias moved silently around her, setting the fire a little higher, as if the act itself might quiet the storm that had just torn through his world. His routine, unspoken but deeply ingrained, kicked in. He didn't look at her directly, didn't force conversation. He didn't need to. His actions were enough. Leanne sat by the fire, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Not yet. Max, too, settled at her feet, the dog's warm body, a steady presence. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling, the occasional shuffle of boots on the wooden floor. Nothing but the space between them. A shared silence, one that would stretch and grow in the days to come. The days that followed felt like slow-moving clouds, heavy with things unsaid. Elias kept to his routine, always the same. Mending fences, feeding cattle, keeping the ranch alive as it had always been. His life was a set of patterns, each task purposeful, deliberate. The silence between him and Leanne grew, but it was not oppressive. It was a quiet space where neither of them expected words, not yet. Elias was not a man of conversation. His world had been reduced to the rhythm of solitary work and the comforting presence of Max, whose simple companionship had once been enough. But now, in the presence of the stranger, the woman who had come from nowhere, Elias found himself stirred in ways he could not name. Leanne had been a quiet presence in the house, a shadow in the corner of the room, a woman who had endured a storm greater than any the land could offer. She ate the meals he left for her without comment, always moving as if trying to disappear. But she was there, her soft, careful steps, her presence like a whisper. She had begun to gather herself slowly. She would tend to the fire when Elias was out, and once, when he returned, the smell of something unfamiliar filled the room. He found her in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a bowl of broth that smelled of herbs and warmth. Elias paused in the doorway, but she didn't notice. She was lost in the task of peeling a potato, her dark eyes focused on the simple chore. It was the first time he had seen her in motion, actively engaged in something. And it was the first time he noticed the quiet strength in her hands, how the movements were graceful but firm, deliberate. "Dinner's almost ready," she said softly, without looking up. Her English was still fractured, but it was improving. Her accent was thick, the sound strange to Elias's ears, but the meaning was clear. Elias stood there, watching her for a moment. His mind, always slow to process, took in the small change. She was trying. For the first time, she was trying to become part of this place that was meant to be his fortress of solitude. He said nothing, just nodded, but something flickered in his chest, an emotion unfamiliar to him. Gratitude? Perhaps. The next morning, the weather had shifted. The wind, though still cold, had a different bite to it, as if the earth itself was beginning to thaw. Elias set out to tend to the cattle early, and Leanne stayed behind, as usual. Max trotted beside him, but the dog kept glancing back at the house, as if ensuring Leanne was safe. The first few weeks had been a careful dance. Elias kept his distance, respecting her space. He had no expectations. He wasn't sure what to expect, but every so often, he would see a glimmer of something more. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Elias saw Leanne standing in front of the house. Her face was turned toward the horizon, her eyes lost in the vastness of the plains. She wasn't waiting for him. She wasn't looking for him. She was simply there, alone, in the wilderness that stretched endlessly before her. There was a sadness in her posture, a quiet acceptance that seemed to echo his own. Elias hesitated, but then, like some unspoken command, he walked toward her, his boots crunching on the snow-packed ground. He didn't know why he was moving. It wasn't for conversation. It wasn't even for company. He had simply learned over the years to listen to his instincts, and they told him to go. She turned as he approached, her face still unreadable, but there was something in her eyes now. Not fear, not panic, but a softness, as though she was finally allowing herself to see him, to see that he was there. "Max," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. She looked down at the dog, who sat beside her, his amber eyes locked on hers. The dog was always close to her now, a constant, unwavering companion. Elias stopped beside her, his posture stiff, but he didn't speak. He wasn't sure what to say. The wind began to stir again, gently this time, carrying with it a scent of rain and the promise of spring. Leanne shifted, and Elias could feel her gaze on him, searching, almost asking for something. What, exactly? He didn't know. But before he could think of anything to say, she spoke again. "I've lost everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were afraid the wind might carry her words away. Elias did not reply. He simply nodded. He knew loss, more than most. "My husband." Her voice trailed off, and for the briefest moment, Elias saw the shadow of something in her eyes. Something deep, something he recognized. A kind of loss that was not unlike his own. "I know," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The words were heavy with a shared understanding, an unspoken bond between two souls who had both lost everything and yet found themselves still standing. She looked up at him then, as though she had never really seen him before. Her gaze lingered, and Elias felt a pull, something small but undeniable, deep inside him. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was a woman who had come to him in her time of need, and he had accepted her. In his own quiet way, he had offered her sanctuary. And, in turn, she had given him something in return. Something he hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said softly. The simple words hung in the air, an acknowledgement of what had passed between them. It was a moment of connection, fragile but real, and for a moment, the weight of Elias's grief felt a little lighter. Not gone, but eased. Max, sensing the change, stood up and padded over to them. He sat beside Elias, looking between the two of them, as though urging them to take the next step, whatever that might be. The days passed in a gentle rhythm after that. Elias and Leanne began to settle into their shared existence. There were still silences. Still moments where the weight of unspoken things hung in the air, but there were also small moments of understanding, quiet gestures that spoke volumes. One morning, Elias woke to find the house warmer than usual. The fire had been stoked, and the smell of bread baking filled the room. Leanne was already awake, moving silently through the house, preparing a meal. She was becoming part of this place in ways that Elias had never anticipated. He watched her for a moment before moving to his usual spot by the window. The landscape outside was changing, slowly, as winter began to give way to the first signs of spring. The snow melted in small patches, revealing the brown earth beneath. There was life in the land again, just as there was beginning to be life in his heart. And somewhere in the quiet of that early morning, Elias realized he wasn't alone anymore. Elias had never been one for small talk, and Leanne didn't seem to mind. Their interactions were simple, built on the practical rhythms of daily life. They worked side by side, each knowing their role in this fragile truce they had struck. The mornings were quiet, filled with the sound of boots crunching on the frozen earth, the distant lowing of cattle, and the ever-present howling wind. But underneath the surface, something was changing. Leanne had started to look less like a shadow in the house and more like a part of it. She was no longer just a guest, a woman whom fate had driven to his doorstep. She had become a presence, quiet, but real. Elias noticed her small gestures, the way she tidied the fire, the way she made sure the stew was just right. Her hands, delicate yet strong, moved through the house with a grace that contrasted the harshness of the world outside. In the evenings, after the chores were done, she would sit by the fire, watching the flames flicker, her thoughts a world of their own. Elias would sometimes sit across from her, his eyes never quite meeting hers, but always aware of her presence. She was not the same woman who had stumbled into his life like a ghost. In the way she cared for the house, in the way she moved with quiet strength, Elias saw something more, a woman who had weathered storms inside and out. Max, as always, was the bridge between them. The dog had taken to following Leanne everywhere, his loyal presence a constant reassurance. He would nudge her hand when she sat down, or curl up at her feet when she worked by the fire. For a man who had trusted only one creature in the world, Elias found it strange to see his dog share his affection so freely with a stranger, but it was a trust he couldn't deny. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the ranch, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. He had learned to ignore the vast emptiness of the land, but tonight it felt different. The wind, though cold, no longer felt like an enemy. There was something softer in it, something that hinted at change. Leanne stood beside him, her presence unspoken but unmistakable. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at the same horizon he was. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but filled with an understanding. It was a quiet bond, formed not in words, but in the shared space of grief, of survival. "I thought I would never see the end of this," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The land, it feels like it has swallowed everything." Elias turned to look at her, surprised by the words. He had expected silence, the unspoken weight of their shared experiences, but her voice carried something else. It wasn't the desperation he had heard when she first arrived. It was acceptance, a quiet understanding of the harshness of the world, and yet somehow an acceptance of it. "I know," he said simply. His voice was low, the words more of a murmur than a statement. He knew what it was to be swallowed by the land, to feel as though the earth itself was holding you in its grip, forcing you to remember every loss, every wound. Leanne met his gaze then, and for a moment there was no barrier between them. In her eyes, Elias saw the same quiet understanding he had carried for so long. It was the look of someone who had lost, someone who had endured. It wasn't a sadness that defined her anymore, but a quiet strength, a resilience that had taken root in the broken soil of her past. Max, sensing the shift, walked over to Elias, nuzzling his hand before sitting beside him. The dog looked up at him with those wise amber eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, Elias saw something like peace in the dog's gaze. "She's not going anywhere, is she?" Elias said, more to himself than to anyone else. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, but the weight of it hung between them. Leanne didn't speak for a long moment, but then she nodded. "I don't think I am," she said softly. Her words were quiet, but the meaning was clear. She had found something here, something worth staying for. Elias didn't reply. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the horizon, the vast landscape before him now feeling less like a void and more like a place that could hold something new, a small, fragile beginning. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, the ranch began to feel less like a place of isolation and more like a home. The work continued, as it always had, but now there was a rhythm to it, a pattern that included Leanne's presence, a quiet hum of activity that Elias hadn't realized he was missing. The mornings were still cold, the wind still bit at their skin, but inside the house, the warmth of the fire, the scent of bread baking, and the steady companionship of Max made everything feel different. Leanne worked alongside Elias, her delicate hands mending fences, tending to the garden, learning the rhythms of the land. She had become part of the fabric of the ranch, and Elias, though he would never admit it aloud, had begun to rely on her in ways he hadn't thought possible. One afternoon, as the two of them worked in the garden, Elias watched Leanne pull weeds from the soil with a gentle but determined hand. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the ground, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Max lay by Elias's feet, watching the two of them with his ever-present vigilance. Elias could feel the weight of the dog's gaze, but it was different now. There was no judgment, only a quiet acceptance. When Leanne finished with the garden bed, she stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and turned to Elias. Her face was flushed from the work, but there was something new in her eyes, something brighter, softer. "Thank you," she said again, this time with a small smile that softened the hard edges of her face, "for everything." Elias nodded, his usual quietness settling in. He didn't need to say anything. He wasn't good with words, never had been, but there was something in the air, something that told him that, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. It was a simple thing, working side by side, sharing the tasks of the day, but for Elias, it was everything. In this silent understanding, in the way Leanne had become part of his world, he found something he had lost a long time ago, a sense of belonging. As the days grew warmer and the land slowly began to thaw, the ranch came alive again. The earth, once frozen and barren, began to stir with new life. Small shoots of green pushed through the soil, the first signs of spring. And in the midst of it all, Elias found that his own heart too was stirring, not with the fierce fire of a new love, but with something quieter, more enduring. It wasn't the fire he had once known. It was something more steady, more certain, the warmth of companionship, the comfort of a shared silence. And as the first flowers began to bloom, Elias realized that, for the first time in a long time, his world didn't feel so empty. The spring sun warmed the land slowly, coaxing the earth back from its winter slumber. Elias could feel the change in the air. A subtle shift that made the wind feel less like an enemy and more like an old friend, returning to whisper of new beginnings. The ranch, once quiet and still, now buzzed with the sound of life. Max running through the tall grass, Leanne humming softly as she worked the garden, the cattle stirring restlessly in the pens. But there was something else, something Elias couldn't quite name. A tension, quiet but undeniable, had begun to weave itself between the two of them. It wasn't in the way they spoke. Those exchanges were still simple and sparse, but in the small things, the moments when their eyes would meet across the room, when their hands would brush as they passed one another in the narrow hallways. Elias had never been one to acknowledge feelings, to examine them. He had built his world around silence, around the absence of everything he had lost. Yet now, in the presence of this woman, there was something stirring in him, a pull he hadn't felt in years. Leanne, too, seemed different. The hollow look that had filled her eyes when she had first arrived, the wariness that had wrapped itself around her like a cloak, had faded. In its place was something new, a quiet kind of peace, as if she had started to let the land, and the man who shared it with her, heal her. One evening, as the sky darkened into a deep indigo, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the ranch again, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind was calm now, the kind of evening breeze that spoke of clear skies and warmer days ahead. Max lay at his feet, content, as always, to sit in silence. Leanne appeared beside him without a word, her presence as familiar as the land itself. They both watched the horizon, the vast emptiness before them. There was no need to speak. There was only the shared understanding of two people who had both lost everything, and yet, somehow, had found something in each other. After a long pause, Leanne broke the silence, her voice low but steady. "It's strange," she said, her gaze still fixed on the land. "I never thought I'd find peace in a place like this." Elias looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. For a moment, he didn't answer. What was there to say? Peace was something he had thought long lost, buried beneath years of grief and solitude. But standing there with Leanne, watching the land stir with new life, he realized that peace wasn't something you could force or chase. It was something you had to let find you. I never thought it either, Elias said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of years unspoken. I didn't think peace was something I could have. Leanne turned her head to meet his gaze then, and for the first time, their eyes held. There was no fear in her eyes now, no desperation, only the understanding of two souls who had found something they didn't expect. I think we've both found it, she said softly. Elias didn't respond, but the words echoed in his chest. They had found it, this quiet, fragile peace, together. And for the first time in years, Elias felt something stir in him, not the sharp ache of loss, but the faintest hint of hope. The days passed like that, each one a quiet echo of the last. The land began to bloom, small patches of green where the snow had once rained, the air thick with the scent of fresh earth and budding life. Elias worked harder now, as if the land itself had awakened something in him, something that had been dormant for far too long. Leanne, too, had become more than just a guest on the ranch. She had taken ownership of the garden, coaxing life from the soil with her gentle hands. She planted herbs and vegetables, each small shoot a symbol of the new life they were both building. And as the days passed, Elias couldn't help but notice how her hands, once trembling with uncertainty, now moved with confidence and care. It was in the way she worked with the earth, in the way she shared quiet moments with Max, in the way she had learned the rhythms of the ranch without ever needing to ask. She had become part of this place, just as Max had. And Elias, though he would never admit it, had come to rely on her presence in ways he hadn't anticipated. One morning, after a particularly long stretch of work, Elias returned to the house to find Leanne sitting by the fire, her eyes closed, her hands resting gently in her lap. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her boot. The scene was peaceful, calm, and for a moment, Elias simply watched them, taking in the quiet beauty of the moment. Leanne opened her eyes and met his gaze. "You've been gone a long time," she said softly, as if she had been waiting for him to return. Elias nodded. "I had work to do." She smiled faintly, the curve of her lips a small but telling gesture. "You've been working harder lately." Elias grunted in acknowledgement, but there was something in her voice, something in the way she said it that made him pause. She had noticed. She always noticed. "I'm not sure what I'm doing," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the crackling of the fire. "This land, it feels different now, like it's waiting for something." Leanne's gaze softened, and she stood, crossing the room to stand beside him. Her presence was steady, like the earth itself, unshakable. "Maybe it's waiting for you to let it change you," she said, her voice low but full of a quiet certainty. "Maybe it's waiting for both of us." Elias didn't speak for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. But when he finally turned to her, there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of understanding, a quiet acceptance of what had been, and what might still be. "You're right," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Maybe it is." The silence between them was no longer the uncomfortable weight it had once been. It was the silence of two people who had found something in each other, something they had not expected. The warmth from the fire, the steady presence of Max, the sound of the wind outside, it all seemed to fade into the background as they stood there, side by side, no longer just a man and a woman, but two people who had come together in a place they had both thought was beyond repair. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt the faintest stir of something in his chest, something that felt like hope. As the days turned to weeks and the spring deepened, the ranch began to bloom in ways Elias had never expected. The earth, once cold and barren, was now a patchwork of green and life, just like the house itself, full of the quiet, steady presence of two souls finding their way back from the wilderness together. The land had changed, and so had the people who worked it. The days had grown longer, and the sun's warmth was no longer a fleeting guest. It stayed now, slowly thawing the earth, awakening the ranch to life. But more importantly, it had begun to thaw something in Elias, a stiffness in his chest that had been there for years, a sense of reluctance he hadn't even known he was carrying. Leanne had become more than just someone who shared space with him. She had become part of the rhythm of the place, her hands in the dirt, her presence in the house, the gentle but steady way she had become a fixture of his life. The quiet moments with her, whether in the garden or by the fire, had become the most comfortable parts of his day. Max, too, seemed to thrive in this new peace. The dog, once a symbol of Elias's isolation, was now a bridge between him and Leanne. His watchful eyes, always alert, no longer seemed to be guarding against something unknown. Instead, they shared an understanding, a quiet approval. The dog was the key. Max had led her here, and it was the dog's unwavering loyalty that had begun to break down the walls Elias had spent so long building. Elias worked with renewed purpose now. The land, once a cold, indifferent expanse, had become a canvas, one he had forgotten how to appreciate. Leanne had a way of making the simplest tasks feel different. When they worked together, whether in the garden or mending fences, it felt less like work and more like something shared, something created together. But there was still something unspoken between them. The quiet space between their words had become a kind of language of its own, a language made up of small gestures, fleeting glances, and touches that weren't quite accidental. Elias wasn't ready to confront it. Not yet, but he could feel it, like a thread pulling him closer to her, and he couldn't deny that the idea of this fragile connection was becoming something more important than the solitude he had once fought so fiercely to maintain. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a warm golden glow over the ranch, Elias stood at the edge of the property, looking out across the open land. The wind had died down, and the air was thick with the scent of earth, of life beginning anew. Max lay by his feet, content in the stillness. Leanne joined him after a while, as she always did now, her presence a quiet comfort. They stood together in silence, gazing out at the horizon. The vastness of the plain stretched before them, untouched and wild, but it didn't feel so empty anymore. "I never thought I would get used to this," Leanne said softly, her voice carrying on the evening breeze. "The stillness, the space." Elias didn't answer at first. He just watched the land, the way the shadows shifted and the light began to fade. The sky had turned a soft pink, and he could feel the warmth of the day slowly slipping away. The stillness, the quietness of this place, was no longer a burden. It was a presence, something he could share. "Neither did I," he said quietly, his voice deeper than usual, as though the words themselves carried years of weight. Leanne turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the fading light, the quiet of the evening settling over them both. There was a moment of hesitation between them, as though each was waiting for the other to say something. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice tentative. "About peace, about letting it change us." Elias met her gaze, his brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing, allowing her to continue. "I think I understand it now," she said, her voice steady. "Peace isn't something you find, it's something you allow. Something you let in." Elias's heart seemed to still at the words. They weren't just words, they were an invitation. An invitation to something he had never allowed himself to consider, not for years, something more than just survival. Something deeper than the emptiness that had defined his life. Max, sensing the shift, stood up and padded over to Leanne. He nudged her hand, as though urging her forward, as though telling her to take the next step. Elias didn't move. He just watched, his eyes locked on her. There was something in the way she held herself now, something that made him feel like they were standing on the edge of something new, something he hadn't expected. Leanne reached down and stroked Max's head, her fingers gently scratching behind his ears. The dog looked up at her, his eyes soft, and then turned to Elias, as if to say, "You've come this far. Now let go." The silence stretched between them for a long moment, thick with unspoken words. Then, without thinking, Elias took a step forward, closing the space between them. The air seemed to crackle with a quiet tension, and for the first time in years, Elias felt something else, a pull, a kind of magnetic force that drew him closer to her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a barrier. It was a bridge. When he reached her, he simply stood there, looking down at her, his presence like a quiet weight. There was nothing to say, not yet, but something had changed. Something had shifted. Leanne looked up at him then, her dark eyes soft with something unreadable. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stood there, waiting, as though giving him the space to make the next move. And in that moment, Elias understood something he hadn't allowed himself to understand before. He wasn't alone anymore. The quiet shift between them wasn't loud. It wasn't immediate, but it was there. The first fragile thread of connection had been woven, not in words, but in the quiet act of simply being present, of standing together in the stillness of the land they both shared. Elias reached out, his hand brushing against her arm, and though it was just a touch, a simple, fleeting gesture, it felt like a promise. A promise that the silence between them would no longer hold them apart, and for the first time in years, Elias allowed himself to feel something other than loss. He allowed himself to feel something like hope. The days that followed were filled with quiet, steady progress. The ranch continued to come alive under their care, new crops sprouting in the garden, the cattle thriving in the warm spring air. And slowly, Elias began to allow himself to move forward, to let go of the weight of the past. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to control it. Leanne had become more than just a woman who had stumbled into his life. She had become part of it, part of the land, part of the life he had thought he had left behind. And as the sun set on the horizon once more, casting the ranch in the soft light of dusk, Elias realized that peace wasn't something you waited for. It wasn't something that came after you had earned it. It was something you allowed, something that came when you stopped fighting it, when you opened yourself to it, even in the quietest of ways. Max sat by their feet, his head resting between them, the quiet symbol of their connection. The ranch, once a place of solitude, was now a home again, a place not just of survival, but of something more. And in that quiet, steady peace, Elias knew that his life had changed forever. The seasons had come full circle, and the ranch stood in the heart of summer, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and earth. What had once been a barren, empty place, cold and silent, had transformed into something warm, something alive. Elias had never expected that the simple act of letting someone in could change everything. But there, in the steady rhythm of everyday life, surrounded by the hum of the land and the company of Leanne and Max, he found something he hadn't known he needed: belonging. Leanne had become a part of the ranch in ways that went beyond the tasks they shared. She had taken the garden as her own, coaxing it from the earth with a patience that mirrored the quiet, patient love she had brought to the house. She no longer moved through the house like a stranger, like someone on the outside looking in. She had claimed it, this space, this life, as her own. Max, ever the steady companion, had become the glue that held it all together. His loyalty, unshakable and pure, had bridged the gap between Elias and Leanne, just as it had brought her to him in the first place. The dog was the key to this new life, the bridge between the isolation Elias had carved for himself and the companionship he had once thought impossible. But it wasn't just the physical work, the chores, or the land that had changed. It was the unspoken things, the quiet moments by the fire, the shared looks that no longer carried the weight of doubt, but the weight of something real, something growing. One evening, as the sun began to sink low over the ranch, Elias and Leanne stood on the porch together, watching the sky turn pink and gold. The evening breeze, once so harsh and biting, now felt soft against their skin. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel like it was at rest, like the world had paused just for a moment to breathe. Leanne stood close to him, her presence no longer an intrusion, but a quiet comfort. There was no need for words. They both understood that. Their lives, so different in so many ways, had intertwined in a way neither had expected. There had been no grand gestures, no promises made, just small moments, small acts of trust, of care, that had built something stronger than either of them had imagined. Elias looked at her, the weight of the last few months settling into his chest, a quiet satisfaction taking root. They had both changed, but in the best way possible. There was no longer any distance between them, no invisible wall that separated them by their pasts. They had found a new way of being together. "I don't know how it happened," Elias said softly, his voice low, almost like a confession. "How I let you in." Leanne turned to him then, her dark eyes reflecting the fading light, her gaze soft. "I think it happened when you stopped trying to keep everything out," she said. "When you stopped fighting it." Her words hung in the air between them, not heavy, but just the right weight to anchor them both in the moment. Elias's heart thudded softly in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt a peace he had never expected. Leanne stepped closer, the quiet hum of the evening making the moment feel sacred, like something too delicate to break. She reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm, the touch warm and steady. Elias didn't pull away. Instead, he looked down at her, at the woman who had once been a stranger but had become so much more. And then, without a word, he reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers in a simple, quiet gesture that spoke volumes. He wasn't sure why he had waited so long to do it. Perhaps he had been afraid of what it might mean. But now, in the stillness of that moment, with the fading sunlight casting long shadows over the land, it felt right. Max, ever watchful, padded over to them, sitting at their feet with a soft whine. He looked up at them, his amber eyes wise, as though he understood the significance of the moment, more than they did. Elias smiled faintly, his gaze shifting from the dog to Leanne. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said quietly, as though speaking to both of them. Leanne nodded, her fingers gently squeezing his. "Yes, but it's been worth it." Quote, "In that moment, Elias knew he had found something he had been searching for without realizing it. Something beyond the endless tasks of survival, beyond the isolation he had once embraced so fiercely. He had found a reason to live, not just to exist. He had found someone to share it all with, someone who had walked through the storm with him, who had found her way to him, and, in turn, found a way into his heart. The sun sank lower, and the cool night air began to settle in. The quiet of the land, the soft rustling of the trees, the distant calls of coyotes, all seemed to fade into the background as Elias and Leanne stood together, their hands joined, their hearts steady. It wasn't a grand romance. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic transformation. It was something quieter, something more enduring. A shared life. A life built on small moments, on trust, on the slow unfolding of a bond that had been forged through hardship, loss, and the simple act of being present for each other. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Elias felt the quiet weight of his past finally lift, the ghosts of the past no longer haunting him. He had come to terms with them, and now there was only the future. Uncertain, yes, but full of possibility. Leanne leaned into him then, her head resting against his chest, and Elias wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. There were no words, only the quiet sound of their breathing, the steady rhythm of two hearts that had found each other in a world that had once seemed too vast to bear. And with that, in the quiet of the ranch, surrounded by the land that had once been his prison, Elias knew that he was finally free.